For 22 years, I was the person everyone called when the warehouse was falling apart. Trucks were late, systems failed, shipments disappeared. My phone always rang first because everyone knew I'd find a solution. I believed that kind of loyalty would eventually be rewarded. Then one ordinary Tuesday, I discovered my manager was getting a $40,000 retention bonus, while the company offered me just $6,000 to stay. First, I thought it had to be a mistake. It wasn't. What happened over the following weeks changed not only my career but the entire operation, and by the end, the company had to hire 3 people just to replace the work I'd been doing alone. At 5:40 every morning, my alarm went off long before the rest of the neighborhood even thought about waking up. By 6:30, I was already walking through the employee entrance of one of the largest distribution warehouses outside Columbus, Ohio, carrying a cup of black coffee that usually went cold before I had the chance to finish it. My name is Michael Carter. I'm 46 years old, and until 4 months ago, I spent nearly 22 years making sure millions of dollars worth of products moved across the country without anyone noticing the work that made it possible. Nobody thanks the operations department when deliveries arrive on time. They only notice us when something goes wrong. That was the job. I wasn't a vice president or a director. My title was operations supervisor, though titles inside our company rarely meant much. I managed inventory flow, coordinated inbound freight, handled emergency staffing problems, and fixed every issue nobody else wanted to touch. If a conveyor system stopped working at 3 in the morning, if a shipment disappeared, if 2 departments started blaming each other, my phone rang. It didn't matter whether I was on vacation, eating dinner with my family, or trying to watch my daughter's volleyball game. Someone always found a reason to call. For years I convinced myself that was a compliment. It wasn't. It simply meant the company had become comfortable depending on someone they never intended to reward. Our warehouse employed almost 400 people: forklift drivers, inventory specialists, shipping coordinators, maintenance technicians, office staff. Every department had its own manager. Every manager had meetings. And every meeting somehow ended with another task landing on my desk. People joked that I knew the building better than the blueprints. They weren't wrong. I could tell you exactly which loading dock flooded after heavy rain, which conveyor belt overheated every July, which forklift battery charger needed to be reset with a rubber mallet, because maintenance never received approval to replace it. Experience teaches you things that manuals never will. Unfortunately, experience doesn't always translate into respect. My direct manager was Brian Lawson. Brian was 34. He had an MBA, expensive suits, polished presentations, and a talent for making simple ideas sound revolutionary. Whenever executives toured the warehouse, Brian walked beside them explaining efficiency metrics, while I stayed behind solving the actual problems. I didn't resent him, at least not at first. Everyone has different strengths. He was good at presentations. I was good at making sure those presentations weren't interrupted by reality. For years that arrangement worked. Until corporate announced a restructuring initiative. That's what they called it. Restructuring. Every employee knew what that really meant. Budgets, headcount, raises, bonuses. Someone would receive more. Someone else would quietly receive less. During the company-wide meeting, our regional director stood in front of a giant screen filled with colorful graphs. Our business has experienced record growth over the past 3 years, he announced. We want to recognize employees who demonstrate exceptional leadership during this exciting period. Leadership. That word echoed through the room. Not performance. Not reliability. Leadership. Corporate loved words that nobody could measure. After the meeting ended, department managers began scheduling individual conversations. One by one, employees disappeared into conference rooms. Some returned smiling. Others looked disappointed. Nobody said much. People always compare numbers, even when companies pretend they won't. Around noon, Brian walked past my office carrying a folder. He looked unusually cheerful. Looks like corporate finally appreciates hard work, he said. Congratulations, I replied. For what? My retention package. He smiled modestly. They're asking me to stay through the expansion project. Good for him, I thought. He'd been with the company 6 years. Maybe they were investing in younger leadership. Nothing wrong with that. An hour later, Human Resources asked me to join a video call. The HR representative smiled exactly the way people smile before delivering disappointing news. Michael, first, we'd like to thank you for your incredible commitment over the past 22 years. I nodded. I'd heard similar speeches before. You've consistently exceeded expectations. Another pause. We truly value your contribution. Whenever someone spends that much time explaining how valuable you are, the rest of the conversation usually proves otherwise. We're offering you a retention bonus of $6,000. She smiled again. We hope this demonstrates how important you are to the organization. I thanked her. Politely. Professionally. Then I closed the meeting. $6,000. Later that afternoon, I accidentally learned Brian's package totaled $40,000. Not because anyone told me. Because Brian left the document open on the conference room table while answering his phone. I wasn't snooping. I simply walked in to grab a marker before our operations meeting. The number sat there in bold letters. $40,000. 12-month retention agreement. Executive development program. Future leadership consideration. For a moment I wondered whether I'd misunderstood my own offer. Maybe there were additional pages. Maybe another payment. Maybe. No. Mine was exactly what they'd said. $6,000. After 22 years. I went back to my office and opened a spreadsheet where I tracked household expenses. Mortgage. Insurance. Utilities. College savings for my youngest son. Medical bills from my wife's surgery the previous year. I entered one new line. Retention bonus. $6,000. Then beneath it another. Brian. $40,000. Looking at the numbers side by side hurt more than I expected. Not because I wanted $40,000. Because the difference finally gave a price to something I'd ignored for years. That's apparently what 2 decades of solving everyone else's emergencies were worth. About 15% of someone who spent most mornings in meetings. The following week proved exactly why those numbers mattered. Monday started with 3 trucks arriving 6 hours late, because severe storms had shut down part of Interstate 70. Normally delayed freight wasn't a disaster. But corporate had scheduled inventory audits, meaning every delayed pallet created paperwork, overtime, and customer complaints. By 8:30, receiving was backed up. Shipping couldn't load outgoing trailers. Forklift drivers had nowhere to move inventory. Everyone started calling everyone else. Brian called me first. Mike, can you straighten this out? I'm already working on it. I've got an executive conference call in 10 minutes. Of course he did. While he explained logistics to executives, I was standing beside dock door 18 reorganizing trailers with warehouse leads, manually rerouting inventory to avoid shutting down half the building. By lunchtime we'd recovered almost everything. Executives congratulated management during the afternoon meeting for excellent operational leadership. Brian accepted the compliments. I received another assignment. That evening as I walked toward the parking lot, one of the older forklift operators caught up with me. Mike, he said quietly, you ever think about leaving? I laughed. After 22 years? Where would I even go? He shrugged. Someplace that notices who's actually holding the place together. I smiled. At the time I thought he was simply trying to be nice. I didn't realize that conversation would stay in my head for weeks. Because sometimes the people working beside you every day understand your value long before you do. For the next few weeks, life at the warehouse settled back into what management liked to call normal operations. The people actually doing the work knew better. Normal simply meant we had enough small problems to stay busy without attracting attention from corporate headquarters. Every morning began the same way. Coffee, safety meeting, equipment reports, staffing shortages, truck schedules, someone calling in sick, someone else's forklift breaking down. By 9 o'clock, the entire plan created the previous afternoon usually needed to be rewritten. That was warehouse operations. No software could predict everything. Experience filled the gaps. Mine had been filling those gaps for more than 2 decades. Around the middle of September, corporate announced the opening of a new regional fulfillment center. Officially, it was good news. The company was expanding. More customers. more shipments, higher revenue. Unofficially, everyone understood what expansion really meant. Our warehouse would absorb the extra workload long before receiving additional employees. The emails started almost immediately. Temporary support, short-term operational adjustments, team flexibility. Corporate had an endless supply of optimistic phrases. None of them unloaded trucks. Within 3 weeks, our daily shipment volume increased by almost 20%. Staffing didn't increase at all. People simply worked harder. Or, more accurately, the same people worked harder. The dependable employees always carried the extra weight. The unreliable ones somehow remained invisible whenever difficult assignments appeared. One Thursday afternoon, Brian walked into my office carrying another stack of printed reports. "You've probably noticed productivity slipping on second shift." I looked up. "It isn't productivity." "What do you mean?" "We're short 7 people. They're doing overtime every weekend. Maintenance still hasn't repaired conveyor line 4. And receiving is using 2 temporary supervisors who started last month." Brian nodded while writing notes. "I understand." "No," I replied calmly. "You understand the reports. I understand the floor." For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled the same diplomatic smile I'd seen in dozens of meetings. "That's why I rely on you." There it was again. Reliance. Not recognition. Not authority. Just another reminder that everyone expected me to solve problems someone else was responsible for preventing. The following Monday gave us a much bigger problem. At 6:12 a.m., our warehouse management system suddenly stopped updating inventory. Every barcode scanned inside the building froze in the system. Forklift drivers couldn't receive assignments. Shipping labels stopped printing. Receiving couldn't check in deliveries. Within 15 minutes, hundreds of pallets were sitting motionless across the warehouse. People started gathering around computer terminals, waiting for instructions. Brian immediately called an emergency meeting. While managers discussed possible explanations inside the conference room, I walked onto the warehouse floor. Standing around wasn't going to restart the operation. I grabbed a whiteboard, assigned employees manually, started recording trailer numbers with markers instead of scanners, created handwritten inventory logs, separated outbound freight from inbound freight to reduce confusion. None of it was perfect, but movement resumed. Products continued leaving the building. Customers never knew our software had failed. 3 hours later, corporate IT restored the system. They thanked everyone for remaining patient. That afternoon, senior leadership held another meeting. Our response today demonstrated outstanding management coordination. Brian received applause. I received another request. "Mike," Brian said afterward, "can you document everything you did today?" "Sure. It'll help us build future procedures." I spent almost 2 hours writing detailed instructions. Manual inventory tracking, emergency shipping process, communication flow, equipment assignments, temporary documentation methods, everything. I emailed the document before going home. The next week, Brian presented my procedures during a regional leadership conference. Without mentioning who created them, one of the maintenance supervisors sent me a photo from the meeting. My flowchart was displayed on a giant projector screen. Brian stood beside it explaining his operational response strategy. I stared at the picture for almost a minute. Then I closed my phone. Oddly enough, that wasn't the moment that made me angry. It simply confirmed something I'd already known. The people making presentations weren't always the people creating the solutions. October arrived with peak shipping season. Inside retail logistics, everyone feared the same 3 months. October, November, December. Holiday inventory pushed every warehouse beyond its comfortable limits. Mistakes became expensive. Customers became impatient. Executives became nervous. Every decision mattered. One Friday evening, just before I was about to leave, my phone rang. "Night shift. Mike, we've got a problem." "What happened?" "Trailer 47 was loaded with the wrong inventory." "How bad?" There was a pause. "About 400 televisions." I closed my eyes. 400 televisions meant hundreds of thousands of dollars in merchandise heading toward the wrong distribution center. If that trailer left the property, The mistake would affect stores across 3 states. I'll be there in 20 minutes. When I arrived, the loading dock looked like controlled chaos. Employees were arguing over paperwork. Drivers wanted to leave. Dispatch blamed receiving. Receiving blamed shipping. Nobody was fixing anything. I climbed inside the trailer myself. Compared serial numbers. Checked pallet locations. Found the mistake in less than 10 minutes. Someone had printed duplicate shipping labels during the software outage earlier that week. Simple error. Massive consequences. By midnight we had unloaded the trailer. Rescanned every pallet. Reloaded the correct freight. The driver finally left 4 hours late. Saturday morning Brian called. I heard you saved us last night. We fixed it. Corporate never even found out. I didn't answer. Because that sentence stayed with me. Corporate never even found out. Exactly. They never found out. Not about the late nights. Not about emergency calls. Not about weekends. Not about birthdays interrupted by phone calls. Not about the hundreds of disasters that never became disasters because someone quietly handled them before executives noticed. Success in operations has a strange side effect. The better you are, the less people realize how much work you're actually doing. Late Sunday evening, I sat on my back porch while my wife brought out 2 cups of coffee. You've been quiet lately, she said. I've been thinking. About work. I nodded. I don't know if they actually need me. Or if they've simply convinced me they do. She looked at me for a long moment. You know what I've noticed? What? You only talk about work when something goes wrong. I laughed softly. That's the job. No. She shook her head. That's the company. You've spent years fixing everyone else's emergencies. When was the last time someone fixed one of yours? I didn't have an answer. The truth was uncomfortable. For 22 years, I'd measured my value by how indispensable I had become. I never stopped to ask whether being indispensable actually benefited me, or whether it only benefited everyone else. 3 days later, I received an email from Human Resources. Mandatory meeting. Wednesday, 9 a.m. Attendance required. There was no agenda, no explanation, just a calendar invitation. Something about it didn't feel right. And by Wednesday morning, I finally understood why. Wednesday morning started unusually quiet. That alone made me suspicious. Warehouses are never quiet. If nobody is complaining, something bigger is usually happening somewhere else. At exactly 9 o'clock I walked into conference room C. Human Resources was already there. Brian sat on one side of the table with his laptop open. Across from him sat Karen Mitchell, our Regional Operations Director. I'd spoken to Karen maybe 4 times in 22 years. Every conversation had lasted less than 5 minutes. That told me this meeting wasn't routine. Karen smiled politely. Michael, thank you for coming. No problem. She folded her hands on the table. As you know, the company continues to improve operational efficiency across all regions. I almost smiled. Corporate always began difficult conversations with words like efficiency or optimization. Neither ever meant anything good. We've completed a review of staffing structures. I waited. As part of that review, we're reorganizing supervisory responsibilities. Still waiting. Your position will remain. There was a short pause. But some responsibilities will transition to centralized management. I finally understood. They weren't eliminating my job. They were expanding it. Without saying it directly, Karen slid a packet across the table. Inside were updated responsibilities. In addition to supervising operations, I would now oversee inventory accuracy for another warehouse 40 miles away. Review transportation reports. Train newly promoted supervisors. Provide weekend operational support during peak season. Travel between facilities when needed. I kept turning pages. There was more. Emergency response coordination. Cross-site inventory audits. Monthly process improvement meetings. Additional reporting requirements. It looked less like a revised job description and more like 2 full-time positions combined into one. I looked up. Who's taking over my current responsibilities while I'm traveling? Brian answered. We're expecting you to balance both. And compensation? Karen smiled. Your annual salary remains unchanged. Of course it did. We believe these new responsibilities demonstrate the company's confidence in your abilities. Confidence. There was that word again. Everyone seemed eager to reward confidence. Just never with money. I closed the folder. When does this begin? Monday. Have you hired additional supervisors? No. Additional coordinators? No. Administrative support? Karen shook her head. We believe our existing leadership team can manage the transition. Existing leadership. Interesting phrase. Most of that leadership wasn't being asked to do anything different. Only me. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Brian caught up with me in the hallway. I know it looks like a lot. It is a lot. But this could be a great opportunity. For what? He hesitated. To show executive leadership what you're capable of. I looked at him for several seconds. They've watched me do this job for 22 years. If they still don't know what I'm capable of, one more spreadsheet isn't going to convince them. For the first time since we'd worked together, Brian didn't have an answer. The following week became exactly what I expected. I drove between two warehouses almost every day. Spent mornings solving staffing problems in one building. Afternoons fixing inventory discrepancies in another. Evenings answering emails that should have belonged to department managers. Lunch usually happened inside my truck while driving between facilities. By Friday afternoon I'd worked nearly 68 hours. Nobody mentioned overtime. Supervisors on salary weren't eligible. That weekend my youngest son asked if I was coming to his soccer tournament. I'll be there, I promised. Saturday morning my phone rang at 6:48. Brian. I stared at the screen. My wife looked at me. You don't have to answer. I knew she was right. I answered anyway. Morning, Mike. What happened? We've got an inventory variance. Can't someone else handle it? Silence. Then, honestly, you're the only one who understands this system. I closed my eyes. There it was again. The sentence I'd heard hundreds of times. You're the only one. For years it sounded like appreciation. Now it sounded like dependence. Give me 10 minutes. I hung up. My wife didn't say anything immediately. She simply handed me another cup of coffee. Finally she asked, Do you remember what you promised last night? I looked toward the hallway where my son's soccer bag waited beside the front door. He'd packed everything before going to bed because he was excited. I remember. And where are you going now? To work. She nodded slowly. I know. There wasn't any anger in her voice. That somehow made it worse. I drove to the warehouse. Solved the inventory problem in less than 45 minutes. A receiving clerk had scanned an entire shipment into the wrong storage location. Simple mistake. Easy correction. Anyone with proper training could have fixed it. Nobody else had been trained. By the time I arrived at the soccer field, the second half had already started. My son waved when he noticed me. He smiled. Kids forgive things adults never should. On the drive home I couldn't stop thinking about something. Not the missed game. Not the phone call. The fact that nobody had even tried solving the problem before calling me. The company hadn't built a reliable operation. It had built an operation that depended on one person always saying yes. That realization stayed with me for days. Then, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, everything finally caught up with them. It started with an early snowstorm. Highways closed. Drivers were delayed. Several suppliers missed delivery windows. By noon almost 70 trailers were waiting outside our facility. Inside the warehouse every available dock was occupied. Receiving couldn't keep up. Shipping was falling behind. Customer service phones were ringing non-stop. Executives began joining conference calls every hour. Everyone wanted updates. Nobody wanted solutions. Those still landed on my desk. At 4 o'clock that afternoon Brian hurried into my office. Corporate wants hourly recovery reports. I don't have time. I know. They're insisting. I looked around the warehouse floor through my office window. Forklifts moving non-stop. Employees skipping breaks. Supervisors trying to cover 3 departments at once. The operation needed leadership. Not paperwork. I'm not writing reports. Brian looked surprised. What? I'm going downstairs. They need help. Corporate needs updates. They can wait. For the next 6 hours I worked beside my team. Moved freight. Directed traffic between loading docks. Helped unload trailers. Reorganized temporary storage. Made decisions instead of writing emails about them. By midnight we'd cleared almost half the backlog. Not because of a miracle. Because everyone stopped worrying about presentations and focused on the work. The next morning Karen called. Michael. Morning. I notice we didn't receive your recovery reports. That's correct. Why not? Because I was recovering the operation. Silence. Then. We need documentation. You have shipments leaving on time. You have customers receiving orders. You have a warehouse that's operating again. That's the documentation. Karen didn't respond immediately. Finally she said, "We'll discuss this later." I calmly answered, "I look forward to it." I hung up the phone. For the first time in years. I wasn't worried about the conversation that was coming, because something inside me had already changed. I no longer felt responsible for protecting decisions made by people who never accepted responsibility themselves. And although I didn't know it yet, the hardest decision of my career was only a few days away. The meeting Karen promised happened the following Tuesday. This time it wasn't in the conference room. It was in the executive offices overlooking the warehouse floor. From those windows everything looked organized. Forklifts moved in neat lines. Employees followed marked walkways. Trucks backed into loading docks one after another. From up there operations almost looked effortless. It reminded me of something I'd learned years earlier. The farther people sat from the work, the simpler they believed the work was. Karen wasn't alone. Brian sat beside her. So did our Vice President of Operations, Richard Collins. I'd exchanged exactly 2 emails with Richard during my entire career. Neither had been longer than 3 sentences. He started the conversation. "Michael, we've received concerns regarding communication during last week's weather disruption." I expected that. Karen folded her hands. "You chose not to submit the requested executive reports." "I chose to keep freight moving." Richard leaned forward. "Those reports were important. So were the 200 employees waiting for decisions." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally Richard said, "Leadership requires balancing both." "I agree. So why didn't you?" His eyebrows lifted. "What do you mean?" "I mean while I was unloading trailers with supervisors and forklift operators. Every member of senior leadership remained on conference calls asking for updates." Again. Silence. "Not uncomfortable for me. Uncomfortable for them." Richard changed direction. "Let's focus on solutions." "All right. What do you need to perform this role more effectively?" It was the first honest question anyone had asked me in years. I answered honestly. More supervisors. Updated equipment. Cross-training. Competitive pay. Authority to make staffing decisions. Karen immediately began writing notes. Richard nodded. "Those are reasonable requests. I've been making them for 6 years." That stopped his pen. "You have?" "I can forward every email." No one questioned me, because they knew I could. Every recommendation had been documented. Every staffing request. Every maintenance concern. Every process improvement proposal. Most of them had been declined because of budget limitations. Now those same limitations had become operational emergencies. The meeting ended with the usual promise. "We'll review everything." I thanked them, walked downstairs, and returned to work. But something changed after that conversation. Executives suddenly started visiting the warehouse more often. Not because they wanted to understand operations, because they realized someone else eventually might. Auditors arrived the following week. Then human resources. Then a consulting company. Everyone carried clipboards. Everyone asked questions. How were emergency decisions made? Why did so many critical processes depend on one supervisor? Why were staffing requests repeatedly denied? Why were experienced employees leaving faster than they could be replaced? The answers were already sitting inside years of emails. Nobody had bothered reading them before. 3 weeks later Brian stopped by my office. He looked exhausted. "I owe you an apology." I looked up from my computer. For what? I thought management noticed everything. He laughed quietly. They don't. They notice whatever reaches the conference room. He sat down across from me. You know they're reviewing the retention bonuses. I heard. They're talking about restructuring leadership. I heard that too. Brian looked around before lowering his voice. I didn't realize how much you actually handled. I smiled politely. I know. He nodded. I should have paid more attention. That was probably the most honest conversation we'd ever had. Not because everything had suddenly become fair. Because for the first time, someone admitted the truth. The following Monday, I received another meeting invitation. This one surprised me. Richard was there again. So was Karen. Human Resources joined remotely. Richard spoke first. We've completed our operational review. I waited. We'd like to offer you a senior operations manager position. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a significant salary increase, additional vacation, a management bonus, and responsibility for both warehouses permanently. It was more money than I'd ever earned 5 years earlier. I would have accepted immediately. Instead, I closed the folder. Richard looked confused. Is something wrong? No. It's a generous offer. It is. Karen smiled. We're glad you think so. I didn't say I was accepting. The room became very quiet. Richard leaned back. May I ask why? You can. I paused for a moment. Because this offer wasn't made when the work deserved it. It was made after the company realized what happens without it. Nobody interrupted. I've spent 22 years solving problems. I missed birthdays, anniversaries, my son's games, family vacations. I answered my phone every weekend because I believed loyalty would eventually matter. I looked at the folder one last time. This isn't recognition. It's damage control. Karen looked genuinely disappointed. We'd still like you to stay. I know. And I'm grateful. But I've already accepted another position. Brian looked surprised. You have? I nodded. About 3 weeks earlier, one of our equipment vendors had reached out after hearing I might be looking elsewhere. Their company needed an operations improvement manager. Instead of managing emergencies, the job focused on designing warehouse systems that prevented emergencies from happening in the first place. Monday through Friday. No overnight calls. No weekends. No expectation that one person would carry an entire operation. The salary was higher than the offer now sitting in front of me. The benefits were better. Most importantly, during the interview, nobody asked whether I was willing to sacrifice my personal life. They asked how I developed teams, how I solved operational problems, how I trained future leaders. For the first time in years, people seemed interested in preventing fires instead of finding someone willing to keep putting them out. Richard closed the folder. I wish we'd had this conversation sooner. So do I. My final month passed quietly. I documented every process, trained the supervisors who wanted to learn, updated procedures, recorded everything anyone might need after I left. I didn't delete files. I didn't hide information. I didn't make anyone's job harder. Professionalism isn't something you practice only when you're appreciated. It's something you choose for yourself. On my last day, hundreds of employees were already working when I walked through the warehouse one final time. Forklift drivers waved. Maintenance technicians shook my hand. Several shipping clerks stopped what they were doing just to wish me luck. One of the oldest employees smiled and said, I guess they finally figured out what you were worth. I smiled back. I think I finally figured it out. For months have passed since then. Now I spend my days helping companies redesign warehouses before problems become crises. Sometimes I visit facilities that remind me of my old workplace. Managers rushing from meeting to meeting. Experienced employees quietly carrying impossible workloads. Everyone assuming the dependable people will simply keep saying yes. Whenever a client asks me what the biggest operational mistake a company can make is, my answer is always the same. It isn't outdated equipment. It isn't bad software. It isn't even poor planning. The biggest mistake is believing your most reliable employee will never leave. Because eventually, The person holding everything together realizes something important. Being indispensable means nothing if you're only indispensable when someone else needs you. The company I left eventually hired 3 people to divide the responsibilities I'd handled alone. Not because the work suddenly became larger. Because someone finally measured how much work had always been there. People sometimes ask whether I regret leaving after 22 years. I don't. The hardest part wasn't resigning. The hardest part was admitting that loyalty without respect eventually becomes another form of taking advantage of yourself. Every Friday now, I leave work at 5 o'clock. My phone stays silent through the weekend. I haven't missed one of my son's games this season. Last month, my wife looked across the dinner table and smiled. You seem different. I am. How? I thought about it for a moment before answering. I'm no longer trying to earn the value I already had. And honestly, that's worth far more than any retention bonus ever could be.